Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at John chapter 18, verses 28 through 40. This will be the trial of Jesus before Pilate, but part one, because it's going to spill over into the next chapter as well. Up to this time, we've already seen the arrest of Jesus. That was described in chapter 18, verses 1 through 11. Remember, he was betrayed by Judas Iscariot. He goes out to meet them, which maybe is speaking about going out of the garden. And he gives instructions. Jesus gives instructions to those that are arresting him. Let these other people go, these disciples. And Peter pulls out his sword and goes after one of them, cuts off an ear, and we find out that the servant's name was Malchus. And so Jesus is taken into custody, but the disciples are allowed to leave. Next, we see Jesus before the high priest, starting in verse 12, chapter 18, verse 12. And we're told that the high priest was Annas, but Annas was the father-in-law of the current high priest. Remember, the high priest was supposed to be for life, but the Romans had made him step down, but he still sort of retained their prestige. And Peter had followed along with another disciple, an unnamed disciple, who was known, at least to the doorkeepers of the place where they were taken. And that got Peter entrance. And then Jesus was taken from Annas to Caiaphas, maybe in the same building, or maybe in an adjacent building, but doesn't seem like too much time passed there. And Caiaphas, his son-in-law Caiaphas, the reigning or serving high priest, didn't really reign, but a serving high priest. Uh, and while they were there, Peter manages to deny even knowing Jesus, not once, not twice, but three times. That was a fulfillment to the prophecy that had been given by Jesus. And now, as we come to chapter 18, verse 28, we're going to see Jesus before Pilate. Pilate was the Roman principus, that is, the Roman governor. And we come now to verse 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium. Now, that term praetorium is a Latin word. It's spelled with Greek letters because we're reading this in Greek, but it's a Latin term, and I think the best translation would be the headquarters. And as such, there were actually several praetoriums. You could have several headquarters. There was one in Caesarea. That was where the capital was, the political capital of Israel. That's where the Roman governor would have his regular seat of power. You say, why was he here in Jerusalem? Because there was a Passover. Not that he was observing it, but that's where the action was, and that's probably why he was here. And sure enough, there's a praetorium, a headquarters, here in Jerusalem. Now you say, where is that headquarters? We're going to talk about that in a bit. We're not certain, but I think we probably we can make an educated guess. So notice the headquarters of the Praetorium, the place where the Principus, the place where the uh, the Roman governor would be. And notice it was early. Now, I'm glad we had that notation. Otherwise, we might have thought that a whole day has passed, because the time element's going to be a little bit tricky when we get to that. But it's still early. I'm taking it early in the morning. And they themselves did not enter into the praetorium. That when they themselves are referring to the Jews, the ones that had arrested Jesus. I take it, by the way, that the guard that had been in charge of arresting Jesus was not a Roman cohort, was not Roman guards. It was the Jewish temple guard. And so they didn't enter into the praetorium. The Romans would have, but they didn't, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Now, here's a model. The model is actually of Jerusalem, and it's in Jerusalem. It's located nowadays it's located at what's called the Scroll Museum in Jerusalem. And it shows what Jerusalem would have looked like both in Jesus' day, although that outer wall like the furthest wall from us, that wasn't there yet. That hadn't been and wouldn't be built for maybe 10 or 15 years after the death of Jesus. That wasn't there, but the rest of the city looked pretty much like it. Notice you can see the temple on the right, far right. Well, you had Herod's palace. Herod had built a palace on the west side of the city, and we believe we've discovered some of the foundation stones. The palace isn't there anymore. But his palace was on the west side of the city. You can have the temple over on the east side of the city. You can see the temple as well as that big wall around the temple courts that served to make it almost. It almost looked a little bit like a fortress. Now, some people some people thought, well, gee, that must be a Roman fortress. It's not. It's a temple, and the reason we know it's a temple is because it's got inscriptions all around it that are in Hebrew and talk about the place of trumpeting, and it's got mikvot, that is ceremonial pools, and you don't put those around a Roman fort. That was the temple, and all archaeologists agree on that. But there was also a fortress on the northwest corner of the temple, and that was known as the Antonia Fortress. That was named after Mark Antony, that had been Herod's patron, and I used to think that that was maybe where Pilate had conducted his trials. Let me just say, I was wrong. I don't, once I actually got to Jerusalem and walked the distance back and forth, I came to the conclusion that it could not have been there because Jesus would not, according to some other accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he's going to be on the cross by around 9 in the morning, what they would call the third hour. And he wouldn't have had enough time to do that if he was being sent from Pilate to Herod Antipas. Luke talks about that, and John doesn't, and back again. So I think all of these things are going to be very close. Now, we have discovered what we believe was the home of Caiaphas. Archaeologists have identified it. It has not just a mikvot, but a ceremonial washing place, but very ornate ones, plural. And so we believe up there in the upper city, we think we have found the home of Caiaphas, which would have been where Jesus was tried before Caiaphas. And from there, it's a short walk to Herod's palace. And I think that's where we end up now. So Herod's palace, this is a different model, but of the same palace, showing what Herod's palace would have looked like. It was built by Herod the Great, and this is before Jesus was even born, and located on the west side of Jerusalem. It had two wings, a north and a south wing, named for Agrippa and Caesar, with a garden in between. You can see how the folks that made the model have shown some trees and a garden in the middle. And with the two wings, there was plenty of room for both Pilate. And I suspect, even though he's not going to be part of our narrative here in the Gospel of John, but Luke talks about Jesus being taken before Herod Antipas. I think Herod Antipas was maybe in the other wing. And I can't say that for sure, but again, I suspect because we're going to have all of these trials take place. Now, John's not going to talk about all of those. He's only going to talk now about the trial before Pilate. But I think as we put all the pieces together, I think this is all going to take place that morning. Now, this palace would have been commandeered by the Roman governor, by Pontius Pilate. After all, he's in charge. Rome is the big power. He can take whatever he wants, and would have done so. It was large enough to also accommodate Herod Antipas in one of the wings, or maybe somewhere nearby, but I would vote for probably one of the wings. Again, I can't say for sure because we don't know, but that would make sense. Now, verse 29, therefore Pilate went out to them. And the reason he's going out to them is because they don't want to come in. They don't want to come into a Gentile place. But he asked them, what accusation do you bring against this man? And so, they brought a prisoner to him. They want something to happen. And he says, okay, what is he charged with? Verse 30, they answered and said to him, if this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. Now, the Gospel of John hasn't mentioned any charges. And I think that they maybe had something in mind, but nothing that they could bring to Pilate. And yet, I think they assume in this answer, I think they assume that he's just going to go along with whatever they want. Now, like I said, the Gospel of John hasn't yet mentioned any charges. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, talk about blasphemy because Jesus had talked about, they had asked him, are you the Christ, the Messiah? And Jesus had said pretty much the idea, as you say, it's so. Um, and so they were accusing him of making himself equal with God, which, by the way, let me just say, um, Jesus is equal with God. He has said plenty of things that would substantiate that. Maybe not to the Pharisees, but still, Jesus had said that sort of thing, and the New Testament affirms that. So I don't have a problem with that statement. But notice they can't take that before Pilate because that might prove in Pilate's mind that Jesus was maybe crazy, but it wouldn't be against the law. It's not against the law to say something silly. And let me just say, for anyone else to say that sort of thing, that they were equal with God, that would be silly for anybody else to say that. With Jesus, it happened to be true. Verse 31, so Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. And so he says, yeah, I don't need to hear about this. You guys, you think he's done something wrong? Judge him. The Jews said to him, we are not permitted to put anyone to death. So notice Pilate says, go ahead. The Jews have already decided. When I say Jews, I'm talking about the Jewish authorities, the temple authorities. Remember that everybody in the story, Jesus, his disciples, his followers, and the people that are against him are all Jewish. So it's, when we read the Jews here, that's specifically the Jews who are seeking to have him punished. They said to him, we're not permitted to put anyone to death to fulfill the word of Jesus, which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. Now, notice they've already determined the penalty. They want to see Jesus put to death, but they're not allowed to put someone to death. And Jesus had already prophesied back in John chapter 12, verses 32 and 33. If I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. And then, in case you didn't get that in verse 32, verse 33 explains, but he was saying this to indicate the kind of death by which he was to die. Jesus was going to die by being lifted up. How do you die by getting lifted up? That's called crucifixion, where you were hung on a cross to die. And Jesus had already prophesied that. That wasn't the way Jewish people didn't crucify people. That was sort of away from their practice. What they would do is they would take rocks and throw them at people, what we call stoning. They would stone somebody to death, but they weren't allowed to do that because they did not have the right. Only Rome had the right to put somebody to death. Now you say, wait a second. Later on in Acts chapter 7, we read of the Jews taking Stephen and stoning him to death. What about that? Well, that was when that was when the governor wasn't in town. When there's an old saying: when the cat's away, the mice will play. And when the governor was out of town, they went and did something illegal, but they weren't supposed to do that. That was an illegal action, and it would be that here. And if they put Jesus to death in full view of the governor, with the governor in town, they could get into some trouble, and they don't want to do that. Verse 33, therefore Pilate entered again. Now notice Pilate had come out to the Jews, and he asked, what was the charge? So now he goes from the Jews back into the praetorium where Jesus is being kept, into the headquarters, and summoned Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? That's what they're charging. They're talking about something like that. Or are they? I don't know if they had mentioned it to Pilate. And Jesus is going to call him on it. Notice, there are other people that had said that sort of thing. Nathanael had said way back in John chapter 1, verse 49, Rabbi, you're the Son of God, you're the King of Israel. Later on, we'd had John chapter 6, verse 15, where we're on a Passover at least a year or so earlier. There were those Jewish people who were intending to come and take him by force and to make him king. That was after he had multiplied the bread and the fish. They said, "Hey, an army needs to march on its stomach. We can make him king, and look at us." There had been a large crowd who took branches of the palm trees just the week earlier, and had went out to meet Jesus as he was coming into Jerusalem, crying out, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel." So there had been other people pronouncing him king. Now, maybe that word had gotten to Pilate, maybe not. I'm sort of going to assume that it had, since he's going to ask the question. And the Jews hadn't mentioned that charge yet. They will. Or if they had, we haven't been told about it. And that's certainly possible as well. Verse 34, Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Did you catch that? Where did you hear this? Jesus hasn't denied it. Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I?" It had apparently been Jews who had said this sort of thing, who had an interest in who might be king of the Jews. Pilate has no interest in that sort of thing. And so he says, "Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me." Notice John chapter 1, verse 11 had said he came to his own. This was back in the prologue at the very beginning of the Gospel of John. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. Here, his own nation had not received him. His own nation had delivered him over. Jesus answered, verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world." You see, he was asked, "Are you a king?" And he answers in the affirmative by talking about his kingdom, but it's not the kind of kingdom that is on planet Earth. It's a different sort of kingdom. So my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting, like Peter had tried to do. But Jesus had stopped Peter, and he had not allowed his other servants to be fighting, so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, and he repeats it just in case you didn't get it the first time. Before he had said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Now he says, "My kingdom is not of this realm." Same idea. Just notice how John the writer likes to sometimes give us synonyms, and that's cool. That's good. Just remember that he's going to do that later on in toward the end of the Gospel of John. So my kingdom is not of this realm, and literally, just it's not from here. It's from somewhere else. Verse 37. Therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are a king." And he picks up on that sort of hint. And Jesus answered, "You say," and our translators added the word correctly because I think it's implied, but it's implied, not stated. Notice, "You say that I'm a king," and he's not denying it. That's correct. "For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth." Pilate's talking about a king. Jesus is talking about the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And so Pilate is being confronted now. He is hearing, maybe for the first time, the truth. I'm not sure that he got a lot of truth from the people over whom he was ruling. Verse 38, Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And I think that his answer is almost a bit sarcastic. There's some people that wouldn't know truth if it reached out and bit them. There are some people who don't want truth because they have a vested interest in accepting a lie. And that might actually describe Pilate as well. So when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no guilt in him." For once, Pilate actually spoke the truth. He had checked Jesus out. He had examined him. "I find no guilt in him." What do you do with someone in whom you find no guilt? If you are a governor, if you are the law of the land, what do? Well, you release him. But that's not what he's going to do. Verse 39, "But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you?" And notice how he phrases it. Not this Jesus of Nazareth. "Do you wish then that I release for you the King of the Jews?" And so the custom would have had somebody released, usually some sort of person that shouldn't ought to be released, maybe somebody who had been a bit rebellious against the government. Of course, on the other hand, probably people that had been rebellious against the government probably wouldn't live long enough to be released. They'd be released rather permanently earlier. But because this custom had been developed, that there would be someone who's in spite of doing something wrong, in spite of being perhaps detained legally, somebody would be released. And so now, do you wish then that I release for you the King of the Jews? And notice how he's using this. I think he's using this knowing that it's a bit of a insult to these Jewish people who have brought Jesus to be punished. He's referring to him as King of the Jews, and that's both sarcastic, but I think maybe a bit of an insult to them. So they cried out again, saying, "Not this man, but Barabbas." And then John, the writer, gives us a one short sentence explanation. Now, Barabbas was a robber. Now, a robber is not a thief. A thief is somebody that sneaks in and steals something. A robber is someone who, with force of arms, doesn't sneak in. He breaks in and takes it. So a robber is somebody who, think the term armed robbery. And that's what Barabbas was. But there's a little bit more here. So you see, we don't know anything about Barabbas except that he was a robber. He was guilty. But we know his name. And that name is actually a compound word. Bar is the Aramaic word for a son. And Abba, maybe you've heard Abba, and the Greeks like to put an S on the end of a masculine name. But Abba is the word for father. So the son of a father. And in a sense, you could describe this as any man. And so here's Jesus, who's going to go to the cross, not just instead of Barabbas, but we're going to find out next time that there will be two others who are already scheduled to go to a cross, who are already scheduled to be crucified. It could well be that Barabbas was the third one. And that when Jesus goes to the cross, he goes to the cross that was planned and purposed, at least by the Roman authorities, for Barabbas. And in a similar way, he goes to a cross that is planned and purposed for you and for me. If we have believed in him, if you've trusted in Jesus as your Lord and Savior, he died on your cross. He died and suffered the penalty you deserve. We call that the penal substitution. That is a penalty. He suffered the penalty that you and I deserved. He took our place upon the cross.